Henry Yu. I'm a professor in the history department, but I've also been a member of the Asian Canadian Asian Migration Studies program at UBC, and also now I'm co-director of the Center for Asian Canadian Research and Engagement, which is a set of people who really work with communities to solve problems. And this is problems in terms of things like anti-Asian racism, but also there's lots of things that are very particular to Asian Canadian communities, as well as the history of Asian migrants to Canada, that really we do research, but we also involve students in kind of embedded experiential projects where they have experiential learning. They're learning by experience and applying things they learned in the classroom out with community partners. And so, yeah, it's been really exciting. Students love it because, it's not about just staying in a classroom and learning from books. It's about applying knowledge. It's about learning from your peers. So they often work in groups. It's also about working with community partners and learning from elders and knowledge keepers who are out there.
I'm Vickey Bungay, and I'm a professor in the School of Nursing here at UBC. And I'm also the scientific director for Capacity, the research center in community engagement and gender equity. And so my work, and with everybody that I work with, has been largely around working within the not-for-profit sector to build capacity for them to be co-leads in research and to provide direction to how we actually think about community engagement, particularly in the health sciences. And so we are a busy, interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral research center, and we work a lot across the intersection between the health sciences and social sciences to really think about health and social care for people across the full gender spectrum who experience violence.
I mean, sustainability can mean many things, but I take it just from experience of having done this for 20 years here in Vancouver at UBC, as well as a decade before that in Los Angeles when I used to work at UCLA. Sustainability is about people, sustained relationships. So we try to minimize the kinds of one-off, even projects that seem like they're very short term. We often try to build it upon existing relationships, build trust by doing things together and meeting mutual goals, spending the time to actually sit down with potential partners. And before we ever do anything, before we ever send a student, it's like just to talk and have conversations to make sure we're aligned on what our goals are. And it's not to say that we have to have the same goals as partners. It's to actually understand what their goals are, and they understand what our goals are, and then activities and projects and Gantt charts are big. Timelines. What are these points where we're measuring whether we're meeting our goals? Reassessment points. And so sustainability is actually a set of processes to check with the stakeholders, to share problems. I say, if you're out running around trying to solve all the problems yourself, you're not going to be able to do it. We talk about being able to communicate enough so that we understand that, one of our partners is facing budget cuts, or one of our partners just doesn't have enough capacity. So how can we share problems so we can find ways to solve them together? How do we do that over time in a sustained ethical way where we can trust each other to look out, obviously, for our own interests? So that's, to me, sustainability in any activity that involves community members, but also on-campus stakeholders and different units working together. And so those are just like almost a tick box. If you don't have these, you're really at risk of not having a sustainable set of activities.
Building off of that, it is all about relationships. So sustainability is the relationships that you have, what you develop, all of those kinds of things. But at the core of that is reciprocity, and not that transactional, I give you, you give me, or this for me or that for me. But truly, what do we each bring? What are our strengths? What are our challenges that we face individually within the team? What are our strengths that we have? How do we kind of put this all together? But how do we value what everybody brings? So the sustainability for me is all about that mutual respect, recognizing there's all kinds of ways to think about knowledge and problems and issues, and then how do you come together to really harness the value of that, what each person is bringing, what each group is bringing, and right across from, your academics, your not-for-profit, your public sector, all those kinds of things. And as we're doing that and thinking about sustainability, it's what are we doing that's useful? So that's a big part of when I think, oh, what does sustainability really look like? Is are we all value added? And value added can mean many different things. And just like Henry said, it's like, what am I in it for? What are you in it for? But also that, like, how are we contributing to the challenges and problems that we're trying to address? So in my case, we're really looking at a lot of violence, interpersonal violence, discrimination, those kinds of things. But how do we think about them? And how do we share our different understanding of them? And how do we find a shared path? And without that, it's not sustainable.
And just to kind of jump onto what Vickey was saying, I think one of the things that synergy that comes from we can do these certain things, and then you can do these certain things, and it can't be transactional. I can't overemphasize how often I've heard someone say, "Oh yeah, this is really reciprocal," and then when I listen to what they're talking about, I say, "No, that's transactional." Our partners bring a lot of practical expertise because they're on the ground doing things, but also, they have often many ideas they just haven't been able to implement because no one's been listening. And so they say, I've been doing this for years, and if we could only do this, it would make our lives easier. So, yeah, sustainability. It's funny. It's not a end goal. Like the goals actually come from the process. Sustainability is just one of these things. You have to have it, or you really risk bad relationships where someone feels that they were exploited or they were misled or given hope, and then you walked away when your funding ran out or something, and then you left them in the lurch. So it means many things in this context.
Yeah, and that piece of just building off on this notion of trust and that sort of thing is there's a lot of mistrust in research, and this notion that it can be extractive, particularly when you're partnering with various organizations and communities. And so that how do you build that trust over time so that you're not engaged in work that is extractive, that it's, science in, knowledge out, kind of thing. But so sustainability is part of that. How do you overcome some of those barriers that have been constructed, not because anybody's malintentioned or anything, it's just science is a bit behind the community leadership and community engagement. And so part of that is really thinking about how do you navigate and negotiate and understand what the expectations are and what the goals and outcomes are, and that ensure that you're fully engaged and committed, and that you have strategies to really grapple with the fact that you might be working with people who are really mistrustful. They want to work with you and they want to trust, but there's been a history of a very extractive process that has not bode well for them and has really exacerbated stigma and discrimination and those kinds of things. So it's kind of being really aware, as well as what their previous relationships have been with researchers and engaging within that to kind of find your ground and often rebuilding trust in a really meaningful kind of way. And yeah, so it's all part of this really messiness of sustainability.
I think when I'm asked, hey, how have you done what you've done? It's like we have worked really hard on learning and listening through our partnerships, and they have become, I would say, the center of the sustainable practices. Is that you starting with a set of people you don't know anything about, they don't know anything about you, it's going to be mistrust. And I think that's partly something that Vickey already addressed, is that the history of universities out in communities is not a good one. Actually, generally, the mistrust is there for good reason. There have been extractive, what I often call hit and run research, where it's like being hit by a car and then the car just speeds off. Like, research projects have often been extractive and this kind of hit and run experience and feeling, where the university researcher got what they wanted and then was never seen again. Or they send a copy of their abstract of the thing they published, and those are things that really make it hard for all of us who actually want to have sustainable projects to achieve them. A lot of our ethics criteria are protecting the community partners. Indigenous communities have, forced universities literally to say, we don't want anyone even coming near us until you've already culled those who don't know and don't understand what it is to work with us. So sustainability to me from a university perspective is students and researchers should not be allowed anywhere near anybody off campus until they understand the history, until they understand that they may be the problem, that are they really in what they plan and do and what they've even sometimes got funded for, are they really part of the solution, or are they just exacerbating a long history of hit and run or extractive research practices? Are they going to make it difficult for the rest of us? Because every time there's one bad example, people talk and they'll say, oh, UBC has a reputational risk when we allow a single project to go forward that is not sustainable, that is not based on an ethic or ethics of sustainable relationships. Every hit and run project that we green light, it may be there seem like, oh, we got $250,000 or $2 million to do this, and that researcher may have been promoted, and the university might have looked good in this short-term way, but it was antithetical to actually the sustainability of research practices across the board for the whole university, because they just made it really difficult for those of us who are continually doing these kind of projects, as well as that next good idea, that next person who's coming to one of those communities that are often marginalized historically, that are often vulnerable, that have often been exploited. And Indigenous communities are just one example.
Yeah, thinking about, achieving sustainability, I think that piece about it all comes back, as we said already, about building relationships. But there's also this piece of, really shifting out of just building off of what Henry said about the rescue or the researcher as the expert, or how we even conceptualize community or how we conceptualize people, and really attending to what are the strengths. So at the core of sustainability for me is, what are the strengths? Community already often knows, depending on how you define community, but they often know what solutions are needed, and don't frame things as problems, but frame as continuing to build capacity, continuing to address things that they see are needed to improve the quality of life for everybody within the community. So it's listening and attending to that has probably one of the greatest strategies, I think, to kind of unpack assumptions and biases, and even some of the science that's come before in the knowledge, and really attending to this very strengths-based place that many communities, particularly for folks who've experienced marginalization, and they don't sit and say, I'm this or I'm that. They don't get framed by they don't frame themselves in a demographic, a characteristic or a problem, but that they frame as life and living and shared experience, and who are the wise ones, and who are the ones that we need to be listening to, and how that all works together. And so in sort of considering how do you achieve this kind of thing, it's about really coming in from that place of curiosity, knowing what you're good at, and also knowing how you and yourself move through the world and how you might be part of what's challenging for communities, and owning that. Students come and say, you know, I really want to do this work and this, and it's great, and it's so great to have that. And my first question is, oh, have you worked in that community, or you know, how have you come to this place? And it's something that somebody else say, oh, I remember working with patients who experienced this or that. It's like, okay, but again, you're talking about being in a community and partnering, and you're asking me to facilitate entry. It's not that simple. And so navigating how you introduce people is another element of sustainability. It's a huge piece. And because people will ask for those kinds of introductions, particularly in the academic sector, and students are looking, and you want to support them, because people who are asking and want to be respectful, that's who you want to help grow and continue the work. Like an N of one researcher or somebody is just not enough. But how you think about that team is so, so important, and who gets invited and how they're introduced. Like, we think about this in advisory, you know, we get asked in our advisory committee in one of our projects gets asked, you know, we get people say, oh, can we come use your advisory? And it's just, you know, because they can help us, and it's not malintended. And so my response back is always, so give me a one-page summary, and I will take it to the advisory. I'll read it and take it to the advisory and share it with them, and they'll decide if they'll invite you to a meeting or not. That's up to, that's their call, not my call. And so, you know, just attending to, like, once you're engaged, there's a lot of responsibility to contribute to the safety of that community and that what that relationship means. And so those are all navigation and negotiation that have to be done sensitive to who and how people come in and work with you within that context. So,
Like on the access issue, I don't know how many times I could put a quarter in a jar every time someone's asked you, can you introduce me, or can you give me, and often these are access questions, like I need this because, you know, I need to have a letter of support for a grant or this or that. And so, and I'm always trying to be careful not to say, look, I'm protecting my relationships from you, but in my head, it is a kind of thing, you know, that's, if you screw up, I'm going to have to be the one who fixes my relationship with set of people. And so I have to be very careful how to protect them. So sustainability, yeah, funny, because it's like marriages. There's lots of bad marriages, and, you know, there's infinite varieties of bad marriages, but a good, you know, sustainable model is often high communication, multiple iterative, kind of constantly checking where we are with partners, checking where we are with our own team, a kind of succession planning that's constantly, how do we bring new students in a way that's, again, sustainable? How do we make sure that the learnings of those who are moving on to other things is passed on to those who are in the existing team? How do we constantly not just listen, but listen, learn, and apply and try? And if it doesn't work, try something else. There is this kind of adaptability and evolution that I think when you mentioned this need to adapt. You can't think that you've come in with a Gantt chart and again, you know, timing. Just because it's your timing doesn't mean it's going to work for anyone else. So there might have to be adjustments to Gantt charts, and there may need to be stadial, like staged kind of processes where this phase, it may not finish it on the right time, and then, you know, you may need to go back and rethink. So to me, a lot of staging, a lot of, you know, thinking of succession, thinking of long-term viability and how to maintain it. Think about not over-promising and under-delivering, but in fact, making sure you're very careful of your commitments, because they're not then promises. They're like, it's a commitment. You better meet that commitment, and never promise anything that you aren't committed to actually fulfilling.
just in building off of some of that piece of commitment is just so important, and what you can accomplish kind of challenges is that research moves slowly. Nothing moves fast in when we compare to the fast pace of every day, whether it's in service, people providing services, and that happens very quickly, right? And they have to adapt and be flexible to whatever sort of emergent issues are happening within their organizations and the communities that are attending to those organizations. So even understanding that research it has its own time, its own time frame, and really kind of unpacking what it means, right? So people are, they're happy to work together. You've built a great relationship, but there's also this so what does research really look like? What are the different ways to do it? How does it look? And so one of the things is really, how do you build that kind of capacity? And what does it mean to build that kind of capacity to sort of understand, okay, this is what research, this is what's required from funding. This is what's required from peer review, and being really transparent, not to overwhelm and make people responsible for all of those pieces, but to really kind of be able to communicate. These are sort of some of those elements of research that are part of the the institution or the industry of research, and how to navigate within those, and also to be responsive to that kind of those emergent changes, and whether or not the research can go with those, and have you designed it in a way that it can be adaptable and flexible. And if you haven't, has that conversation been upfront? If this is your money and you can only do this, and that kind of thing, and this is the study, versus, how have you built in to flex and change to those kinds of things?
I think that kind of also speaks to what are our strategic goals as a university. If it's just to create research knowledge, I would say we better be really careful whether we understand what we're doing and why, and whether it's actually going to lead to bad outcomes almost inherently. So creating new knowledge, well, for me, a lot of the times, then from a community member's perspective, we already know this. We just need you to validate it so that when we apply for a grant, so there's a kind of way in which we may be doing no more than validating in some formal way for grant purposes something already well known by our partners.
When it's at its best, it looks nothing like we think, is the first thing I'm going to say. Because I think we've got, there's kind of this utopian view of, that it all works and everybody's getting along and everybody's, moving to the same goals, and, and that it's not changing all the time, or that kind of thing. So I think when it's at its best, it has its humor in recognizing there's no such thing as a really good plan, because you've got to be adaptable and flexible. So I think that for me, that's one of the biggest things, is kind of at its best, it is responsive to what's happening in the moment. And that is, what I might think about, okay, we've got this great study, and then we have, there's a crisis or a death or a loss of programming or a loss of funding in a particular thing. So our ability to work within that and to continue to, as we often say in teams, to play together in all of those kinds of things is kind of what it looks like at its best. But ultimately, it's that people are having fun in their own way, however it says it, and that people feel like they are contributing, that their voice matters, that that we're learning something together. And again, it's often we are, as Henry says, we're often just validating something in many ways, but it's the process of validation that is where we often learn a lot about each other and about what we can do together and what the possibilities are. And so we're always thinking of those things. But success in that partnership is we recognize what people need, what's being imposed upon them as well, and that we can navigate and negotiate that in a really supportive way for everybody in that kind of environment. So I could go on to these million pieces, but I'll...
Well, and just to pick up on a couple of what does it look like when it's working? To me, again, over time, I think of these moments where we've done something together with a partner or sets of partners, and then we're having those debrief discussions, and it's like, okay, what worked well, what didn't, and there's this desire on the part of the partners, like, okay, we finished this, but hey, we'd like to do something else because this was, really energizing. It was rewarding. We got something done that's been, begging to be done for a long time. And hey, can we think of some other things? And those are really important moments to me because that shows that, there may have been some mishaps, there may have been some gaps in misunderstanding, but clearly we were able to communicate well enough that they still want to work on something else. What are we obligated to do to keep the relationship going? It may be, it's like, oh, let's do a smaller project now that is more weighted towards something that you need. And that's just part of that obligation of maintaining a relationship. Or maybe it's taking a step away. It's like we need to concentrate on something else for a while. It's like, why don't we talk in 2 years? And there's been plenty of times where it's like we pick up again and they're in a different place capacity-wise. They have different goals. In fact, they needed that time away from us. And to not take that personally, like maybe we don't have that hooking back up to see if we can do something together. But to me, that having those sets of relationships that are not only project dependent, but there are relationships that are there that we worked well enough together that we could revisit and say, hey, do you want to work on this together? A lot of those, the best relationships are the relationships first, not project dependent. The projects were ways of doing something together that we're proud of and lead us to want to even look into, hey, can we do something else? What does a good relationship look like? There's trust, there's open lines of communication, there's listening, there's goal setting, there's also a kind of accountability, that debriefing. When things go awry, we have to understand why and to figure out the accountability for that so that we can, again, even say, sorry, that really was because of a pressure that we had that in fact it kind of screwed it up. We're really sorry. Let's do something else together where we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. That's part of conversations of a good relationship.